Guys, welcome to the next video session. So today we're going to be looking at physical activity and its relationship to stress, and in particular to stress reduction. I got a couple of goals for you today. The first one is that you know and remember the American Heart Association's training zones. We've looked at them in a lab before, but I'm going to introduce them to you through lecture today. I'm also going to introduce to you, and I want you to retain the physical activity guidelines for Americans. What is it that the average adult person is supposed to be doing each week to maintain health? We'll run into a couple of terms that I don't think we've run into before that show up on your study guide. So look for RPE and look for parasympathetic rebound in here as well. Okay, well, let's get started then. I really appreciate this quote from Juvenal, the idea of a sound mind in a sound body. And I hope that I continue to pursue both of those. And I hope that that's something you find that you find to be powerful, that you find to be something worth pursuing. As we talk first about physical activity, I'm not going to set the countdown timer for you, but I think it's really helpful for you to brainstorm on your own. Just what is it that you can already recognize for the advantages of physical activity? Why is physical activity actually important? So if you take a moment and just think to yourself about like, what can you list mentally right now? I think we can all recognize that there's a lot of different benefits to exercise. And your thoughts may have aligned with some of the things on this little infographics. They may have gone further in depth, or they may have even extended beyond what this particular illustration shows. But we do know that physical activity is going to be really valuable because it is going to help your mental health. It's going to change your attitude and your perceptions, and it's going to change your relationships. It's also going to change your physical body. So it's going to help with controlling your weight and reducing our risk for heart disease, which we saw was an incredibly important and powerful thing. It can help to actually change some negative habits. So when we looked at nutrition, and here you're seeing that smoking's another of those areas that being active can actually have a really positive influence on. It helps to strengthen your bones, and then should you fall, it helps you to not only reduce your risk of falls, but be more resilient should you have taken a fall, which we all do and all will. So there are a number of different things that I think that we could focus on. We don't need to focus a ton on the physiology of the way that our body is responding. You know from your own lab, your very first lab, that your heart rate's going to be going up. We've talked about multiple times that your blood pressure is going to be rising. You recognize from your first lab that your breathing rate is going to increase. We've talked about in lecture before, not about physical activity, but certainly in relationship to the stress response, that your metabolism is going to increase. That muscle tone was a component of the stress response and certainly is also a component of one of the benefits of exercise. And then when we are active, we have an increased risk of sweating. So it's amazing how many of these things overlap, right? In so many ways, being active is the same thing as initiating that stress response. So why would being physically active be beneficial? Why would we not be trying to avoid that, since we've said we were trying to avoid some of these challenges or some of the challenges that come across with being stressed? Well, the advantage with working on your fitness and working on being active is the idea of parasympathetic rebound. So one of the things that we find with physical activity that's not true when we are simply stressed is that while physical activity will elevate our heart rate and will elevate our blood pressure, if you consistently engage yourself in training and physical fitness, then you will actually see the parasympathetic system have greater influence when you're not active, And that means that most of the time you're going to see, most of the time, as in not when you're exercising, you're going to see a decrease in your resting heart rate and you're going to see a decrease in your resting blood pressure. We're going to see the same thing from that vagus nerve and a decrease of your breathing rate. And just generally, that your body has a greater capacity to deal with these changes in physiology and come back to homeostasis quicker. So that parasympathetic rebound impact is really important. And that's while it can look like stress and physical activity mirror each other in your biologic responses, the difference is in that parasympathetic rebound where fitness sees positive gains because of that investment, where stress response is not going to see those positive gains. And boy, are there a lot of different things that being active will do for you. So again, we don't need to cover all of these different things, but we can see a lot of connection back to things that we've studied. So that change in your heart rate, that change in your blood pressure, we've already talked about. Decreasing your muscle tension was one of the things that when we looked at breathing was important, that if we were breathing from our chest in that area, our upper torso was getting tighter and tighter instead of our diaphragmatic or our belly breathing, that increased muscle tension came across more as or elevated our chance for stress. So being active is going to help to reduce that. We're going to see better quality of sleep, which is an area we'll invest in some time in class here soon. Not sleeping in class, but learning about sleep. We've had lecture content about the immune system. We haven't talked a ton. We did a little bit talk about cholesterol and triglycerides and body fat in a prior lecture on the impact of stress and the connection to disease. The bone, I'm not going to read all of them. You can see this long list of different things that physical exercise is going to be able to do for you. And hopefully that list is impactful enough that if you're not already active, that it makes you interested in considering finding things to be active in ways that really are helpful and meaningful to you. You don't have to pick the ways that the person sitting next to you or that the commercial on TV tells you you have to be active. Find the things that are most enjoyable for you. But are people actually being active? And to what extent are they being active? So this is a report that's run by the federal government. So they go through and they're trying to identify what the risk factors are for health around the United States. This is a phone survey, so people are voluntarily giving out information, but those people are also estimating that information too, right? If you ask me how active am I may overestimate that, or if you ask me how my diet is, I might not be as accurate as if it was being intentionally measured by an individual. So this again is self-reported levels of inactivity. But what you can see here is a pattern that we're going to see through a number of other infographics, I think, across the semester. And maybe you remember some of the illustrations of this already. But taking a look over at our Washington and Oregon area, we are one of the states, one of the areas that has the lowest prevalence of inactivity. So by being green, we're one of the more active states, along with Utah and Colorado, and you can see DC over there. But I'd also highlight, though, if you look at those numbers, it's still somewhere around 1 in 5 people are not active. So even though we may be in a region that's pretty good, we're still just overall, it's still not great. But you can see regionally that there are some influences that are just general trends. And I think that you will see some of those general trends show up again when we look at data across the remainder of the semester. So you're living in a healthy spot, at least for encouraging activity, it looks like. How would we know how active we are, or how do we measure or gauge what a person's activity level is? Since we just looked at the BRFSS calculating or asking people to identify their activity level, how would we know? So When we talk about physical activity, we're really talking about anything that involves large muscle group movements in a repetitive fashion that requires energy. So scrolling on your phone doesn't fit because it doesn't fit that large muscle group action, although it may fit the other spaces. Things like running or jogging certainly do fit, but they don't have to fit. That's one of the pieces, or they don't have to be the way that you pursue physical activity. The illustration there, pickleball is a fun and growing sport, but sport doesn't need to be the way that you pursue physical activity. Anything where you're moving and that involves repetitive motion and engages and requires energy qualifies as physical activity. The upgrade of that, or the distinction of that, is physical activity versus exercise. And exercise, the distinction that creates something to be exercise rather than physical activity, is that you're intentionally planning and engaged in that activity with the specific intent to try and build one area or more of fitness. So physical activity can just be moving around. Exercise is going to be moving around with a purpose to try and gain some type of fitness or multiple types of fitness. Anyway, when we look at physical activity, we break it down typically into three different categories: the idea of light, moderate, and vigorous. And what may feel like really light activity for you may be more moderate for me, and for another person may be vigorous. So the level of intensity is individualized to the person. And how are we going to identify what those things are? Well, we categorize them based off the American Heart Association's training zones. So these are the same things that you used in your calculations for the first vitals lab. And those training zones say that for light exercise, it's going to be between 30 and 50% of your max heart rate. For moderate intensity activity, that's going to be anything that elevates your heart rate up to about 50 to 70% of your max. And then vigorous is going to be somewhere between 70 and 85% of your max. Well, that's one way. And you went through it and we were moderately successful at that. There were a lot of us who made mistakes in some of the calculation components. And honestly, your smartwatches and smart devices will do a lot of this work for you if it's something that you're interested in. And if it's something you truly wish to invest more in, the calculations really aren't very difficult at all. They just might not have been led very well or modeled very well by your instructor. So, um, it's also not the only way that you have to measure intensity. So we can monitor intensity or estimate intensity by a whole range of other ways. I'm going to introduce you to a new one today, or another one today. And that's RPE, which stands for Rating of Perceived Exertion. So as you can tell from the name, exertion means how hard are you working, perceived rec identifies what you feel, and then rating just means given it a numerical value. So the original RPE scale was designed by Borg, and you can see that it runs from 6 all the way up to 20. And if we go back a little bit, if you can go back in time, back in time in memory to when you were working on that very first lab, you might remember that we started off by trying to estimate a person's maximum heart rate, the highest that they should have their heart rate at, as taking the number 220 and then subtracting their age. So for a healthy 20-year-old person, their maximum heart rate would be 200, right? Well, the way that Borg actually developed his RPE scale was he just took those heart rate values, heart rate numbers, and just took a zero off the end. So if you look at this as 200, we know that was supposed to be the maximum heart rate for a young person, for a healthy young person. So 190 is still really close to that. That's very, very hard. And as you see these numbers from 6 to 20, that's just the way that he generated this concept of the perceived exertion scale. Now, it turns out that walking up 3 flights of stairs for one person might elevate their heart rate only up to 85 beats per minute, and another person, it might elevate their heart rate up to 160 beats per minute. So for one person, going up those 3 flights of stairs may be between an 8 and a 9, and for another person, going up that same flight of stairs may be a 16. So it's important to me that we recognize that the intensity level for each person is really unique to that individual person. And that with as you change your fitness, things that felt harder before can feel easier and easier and easier across time. So this might look a little bit familiar. This is essentially this is not essentially, but this is the calculations that you went through on that very first lab, where we looked at taking that predicted heart rate, subtracting your age, we calculated the heart rate reserve, then we utilized the values from the American Heart Association, light being 30 to 50%, moderate being 50 to 70%, and vigorous being 70 to 85%. These are things you're just going to want to jot down and make note of. These are going to be memory marker pieces for you. These are things I want you to remember. But we took those values and then showed how we can actually translate them into our own unique and individual heart rate ranges. So we could calculate for ourselves what our heart rate range should be if we wanted to stay within moderate level intensity, or if we wanted to move into a vigorous level intensity. We could have a clear indicator of what that looked like. So you can practice that if you want. You can utilize that if you want. It is not something that will show up on your quiz or on your exam for you to calculate those things, but you just have the skill if you want it. So I already mentioned this, that Borg's RPE scale initially went from 6, which you see over here in the bottom right, up to 20. And we talked about how he came up with those. But asking a person how they feel, how hard you feel like you're working on a scale of 6 to 20, just wasn't as familiar to us as a numerical range of going from 1 to 10. We have a much higher exposure to rating things on a 1 to 10 scale. So Borg's RPE scale has often been modified down to this 1 to 10 scale that you can see identified here, just because it seems more familiar to most of us. But you can see the same components here as they're color coding sort of the intensity, and you see the descriptors that identify or that describe that level of intensity, whether you're looking at the numerical values from 6 to 20 or 1 to 10. So you're really good at actually knowing how hard you are working. If you think about it for a little bit, especially if you have a scale in front of you with some of the descriptors, we find that individuals across types of activity and across levels of intensity, they're really accurate. They're really accurate. And the way that we know, the way that we describe whether they're accurate or that we define whether they're accurate is we can compare how hard they say they're working to their heart rate, which was what these values were based on, or to their VO2 max, how much oxygen are they utilizing to create energy. So but regardless, I think the more important message is that you're actually really, really good at estimating how hard you are working, as long as you take a little bit of time to think about it, and especially if that is supported by some kind of descriptor or scale that you can visually see and reference against. So in my PE classes and in most of the spaces that I use, I much prefer the 1 to 10 scale, and I usually utilize this particular illustration because of its simplicity and how it blocks things together a little bit more. You can use this if you want. I find it to be very helpful and also simple enough that everybody engages with it quickly, but doesn't have to spend a lot of time reading. Now, one of the other tasks or one of the other goals I really wanted you to remember from this time that we have is the physical activity guidelines. So the physical activity guidelines supported by the CDC and ACSM are recommendations about how active healthy adults should be to maintain their health. So you can see that there are recommendations here for both children, young people, and adults. We're going to be focusing on the adults because that's the range that you're in, and that's more likely to be if you're thinking about adapting this information or using this information with clients or with patients or with others in a professional setting. There's a Most of you are oriented currently towards trying to support and help adults. So what is it that we need to just maintain our general health if we're already healthy American? Well, we should be getting between 2.5 and 5 hours of moderate at level activity If we want to, if you feel like time frame is a real challenge for you, then as we work at a much higher intensity, as we work a lot harder, the time that we have to be working actually drops down to see the same benefits. So you can see those time frames cut in half if you move from a moderate level intensity to a vigorous level intensity, then that time actually drops. But it's just not just aerobic activity that we need to be engaged in. The other aspect that we need to be engaged in to maintain our health is that we should be doing some kind of muscle strengthening twice a week. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to be going to a gym and doing free weights. There are all kinds of body weight and calisthenic type exercises. There's lots of variations in there, but there should be some 2 days a week where we're intentionally trying to maintain or build our own muscular strength, not just cardiovascular endurance. So, if we're looking at moderate intensity aerobic activity being at least 150 minutes a week, then you can see that as being about 30 minutes a day if we are thinking about 5 days a week. And then again, we need those 2 days a week of strength training. So if 5 days a week we're trying to get 30 minutes of activity that's mostly cardio in nature and that's moving us into that moderate range that we know how to calculate. Um, and then the other 2 days we're doing something that's a little more strength oriented, then you're doing great. You're doing perfect. It doesn't mean that you have to separate those, however. So you could be on one day doing both aerobic activity and then doing strength training on that same day. And then maybe you have a rest day or maybe even 2 rest days. So this infographic again also tells you that as we increase the intensity, if you prefer vigorous intensity aerobic activity like running, then you only need to aim for 75 minutes a week to achieve the same kind of health benefits. But again, running is not what I'm recommending for you unless you love it. Going for a walk, running, dance, play, whatever it is that you like, you should be finding the type of activity that's really enjoyable to you so that you want to participate in it, not that it feels like a responsibility. So if we know that we're supposed to be moderately active for at least 150 minutes a week in aerobic sense, then we've talked about how you can calculate that to create a range for yourself about what your heart rate should be, so you could monitor what that is. Or you can simply be intentional about thinking when you are being active, does this indeed feel like something between a 4 and a 6 on a scale of 1 to 10? Do I feel like I'm really working out at a moderate level? If you're working out below that, you'll know it if you think about it. If you're working out well above that, you will certainly know it, and you probably won't even have to think about it. You'll recognize early and easily that this is pretty vigorous, this is pretty hard, this is maybe all the way up into very hard or a max effort, as you would have to stop after a very, very short time. Certainly wouldn't be able to do max effort for 150 minutes for that week. So if that's the expectation, that's what the physical activity guidelines say, is that we should be getting about 30 minutes a day, most days of the week, of moderate level cardio and 2 days of strength training. Are we doing it? Well, you can see in this particular graph here, this is now measured and monitored rather than self-reported. So this is pulling data, or this is looking at data from actual measurement pieces. And here we are looking at our adults, ages 18 to 64, and how many people are in fact meeting those expectations. So now again, the darkest color in this particular case represents the best states that are performing best in this category. And if you are in the darker burgundy color, then participants in your state generally aren't doing so well about meeting those guidelines. And as you can see, those same general sort of patterns exist. They're not nearly as clear, or they don't align perfectly with when people were self-reporting. For example, in Oregon, when we were self-reporting, more people thought they were more active than they truly were, apparently. Again, if we look at those overall values now, though, we actually see that this has gone up a little bit. We're getting approaching 1 in 3 people who are actually meeting the guidelines. Not in Oregon, however. That would be in Washington and Idaho are both two of our neighbors that are actually getting at that highest level. Oregon is somewhere around 23 to 26% of us that are meeting the federal guidelines. So, is it changing? Are we getting more or less active across time? This graph admittedly is a bit old. I'm looking for new data to be able to give you something that's a little more current. If we look at this graph, we can see a general, very slight upward trend moving from 2008 to 2017. And one of the things that you might also recognize is that living in an urban area is actually a bit of an advantage. Let's see where my, oh, I was hiding the key there. So let me move this over. The solid line's representing the average. The urban line is representing the dashed line, I should say, rather. The heavy dashed line is representing those trends within people living in urban spaces, and the dotted line is representing those trends for individuals in rural spaces. So if you've always thought that people out in rural spaces and working on farms are being more active, data shows that that's not true. They're actually more active in urban settings, partly because we may do more walking, partly because there could be a whole host of different trends and reasons for that trend, rather. Um, and maybe you're hopeful. I mean, I prefer seeing it slightly upward trending than slightly downward trending, but it's not a really significant trend. It's not a really large growth. And even at best, we're only looking at less than 1 in 4 who are meeting the guidelines according to this particular graph. So we have a lot of room for improvement as far as getting people to meet those physical activity guidelines. If we want to look at the differences between men and women, just making sure I didn't hide anything on my screen there. If you want to look at the differences between men and women, men generally are a little more active than women, and those values seem to be relatively stable. Again, this goes from 2008 to 2016, so it's a little older data than might be ideal, but it's the most recent that I could find that demonstrated clearly male versus female. So as we come to a close, we can talk about exercise or we can talk about activity in a couple of different ways. We defined what physical activity was. It was just any kind of motion that included large muscle groups that was repetitive and required energy expenditure. Exercise was a little bit different. It was going to be intentional physical activity, purposely engaged in to try and build some area of fitness. Now, what are those different areas of fitness and what's going to be important to you? There's all kinds of different ways that we can identify or talk about the different areas of fitness. I think maybe one of the simplest is just talk about the top 3 areas or categories of fitness that we might want to work on aerobic exercise, that we might want to work on strength training, that we might want to work on flexibility. There are definitely much more detailed ways to approach thinking about what kind of exercise you want to engage in or what kind of areas of fitness you're more interested in trying to improve. We talk about In exercise science, we will often break fitness into 2 primary categories. We'll talk about it as health-related fitness, and we'll talk about it as skill-related fitness. Health-related fitness, we have lots and lots and lots of data saying that if you are working on these different aspects of your fitness, that there are profound impacts on your longevity and your mortality and morbidity. So how long you're going to live and how long you're going to live without illness or disease. So those 5 components of health-related fitness are things that you definitely saw in the physical activity guidelines. We want to be working on strength. We want to be working on cardiovascular endurance. We want to add into that flexibility. And as we do that, then we're likely to see positive changes towards body composition. When we are working on cardiovascular endurance, we're very frequently co-opting into muscular endurance as well. So we can kind of pair muscular endurance or muscular strength, sort of get paired together sometimes. So this is one more detailed way of thinking about your own exercise program. You could be thinking about wanting to make changes in one or all five of these different categories. One area that isn't necessarily hit upon or planned if you're simply looking at the health-related components of physical fitness is more towards that anaerobic type of exercise. We certainly had the aerobic with cardiovascular endurance, but anaerobic means it's some kind of activity, some kind of exercise that's really intense in power and strength, but it's pretty short in duration because we fatigue so fast. So individuals who are more interested in anaerobic exercise oftentimes are doing so because they're really interested in performing in some way. So whatever sport they may be interested in or whatever games they enjoy or however they're challenging themselves, they may want to see improvements in their own performance. And that relies then on including not only these areas, these foundational areas of fitness, but also investing into some of this power and strength type of areas of fitness. So you can see also that we break that area of skill-related fitness down into a number of different categories. These things all do help and support you, but we don't have as much data to identify them as having the same profound impact on your mortality and morbidity that we do see with health-related fitness. These are things that have a greater capacity to make a big influence on your performances. So all that to say, again, I would really advocate for our stress management class that instead of thinking necessarily, especially if you're new to activity, instead of thinking about building a specific area of fitness, I think that will end up feeling more prescriptive or more like a responsibility. I think it's much, much, much better for you to think about what do you really enjoy playing or doing or engaging in. And then as you engage in that and you find another community who also engages in that from the social nature there and just from the joy that you're experiencing, you're going to want to continue to return and come back. And I think that's probably the best way for you to pursue physical activity. We are going to be asking you, or you are going to be asked to meet those physical activity guidelines for a week. If you elect to, because I know of the profound benefit it has both for your stress management and for your long-term health, if you elect to, you can continue that trend throughout the remainder of the semester, not only experiencing the personal benefits, but also experiencing a grade benefit at the end of so it will be an extra credit component should you continue. So as you are looking at as you're looking at the lab, and I notice now that this has the wrong year on there, but as you're looking at the lab, then you will find that I'm going to ask you to track your own activity and match that physical activity guidelines. And that will be everything. I hope you have a good day. Thank you for sticking around with me throughout this lecture.